The entire thesis has been divided into 6 chapters. The first chapter deals with introduction. The second chapter discusses the literature review. The third chapter pictures the conceptual framework after which hypotheses have been developed. The fourth chapter discusses in detail the research methodology adopted. The fifth chapter discusses the results and their interpretation. Finally, the last chapter discusses the findings, proposes theoretical and managerial implications, limitations, and directions for future research. This is the outline of the presentation. The presentation would mainly focus on the introductory background, theoretical frame, context and importance of the study, research questions and objectives, scope of the study, literature review, conceptual model, hypothesis development, pre-test and pilot study, research techniques, psychometric evaluation, results, theoretical and managerial implications, limitations, and directions for future research. The first part of the research work sheds light on the issue of retention in the IT industry, particularly in the Indian IT context. It has been asserted that globalization, technological advancements, deregularization, and demographic changes have aggravated the problem of skill shortage and has become a global concern. According to a report by Capgemini, there exists a talent gap between skilled and not so skilled employees, where India was ranked second highest with a skill gap of 64%. Further, according to a survey by Manpower Group, India is one of the worst affected markets where almost 45% of the companies face issues while filling up their vacancies. Amidst talent shortage, job hopping has also become a common phenomenon among Indian IT professionals, which has kind of created a mindset among employees that they could be easily absorbed in this particular sector. So what organizations nowadays are doing, that they're resorting to diverse tactics and strategies in order to showcase them as a desirable place to work. One such strategy that has been considered in this study is employer branding. In a seminal paper of 1996, Amber and Barrow coined the term employer brand, where they identified it as a bundle of functional, economic, and psychological benefits provided to the employees. They identified training and development opportunities relating to the functional benefits, monetary value relating to the economic benefits, and employee sense of belongingness and well-being relating to the psychological benefits, portraying an ideal blueprint of employment. According to the Chartered Institute of Personal Development, employer brand has been defined as a set of attributes and qualities that are often intangible, making an organization distinctive, promising a particular kind of employment experience, and appealing to those who will thrive and perform best in its culture. The concept of employer brand has actually emerged from the traditional concept of product brand that is based on the premise of providing unique sales propositions to the customers, which is headed by the marketing department. On the other hand, employer brand is based on the premise of providing unique employee value propositions to the internal as well as external employees, which is headed by the human resource department. The term value propositions has actually emerged from the marketing technique of brand positioning, that is brand key, which adds value to the product or service brand. In similar term, these value propositions, they add value to the employer brand. These propositions are based on the give and get of the employment agreement, connoting a balance between what is being offered by the organizations with employees' performance and their productivity. So better relations exist between employees and organizations when these values align with that of employees' needs. But the contemporary employer branding strategy focuses on the collaborative efforts between the marketing as well as the HR department, where both these departments have to work together in order to identify the target groups based on their demography, based on their age, gender, experience, educational qualifications. Then there is a need to identify the bundle of value propositions to be provided to the employees. Then there is a need to implement the branding strategy using internal as well as external communication channels. Organizations generally use current employees as brand advocates for internal communication channel, and for external communication channel, they rely on word of mouth, social media, or newsletters. Then there is a need to monitor the branding strategy to find out how many employees it has been able to attract as well as retain. The concept of employer brand could be better understood using various theoretical frames. One of the oldest is the resource-based view, which is based on two factors of resources and capabilities. Resources, they could be anything, they could be material, staff, money, tangible or intangible assets, whereas capabilities is the firm's capacity to deploy those resources that provides them with a competitive advantage. In terms of the branding concept, employees' skills and competencies, they become those resources, and organizations' branding efforts, they become those capabilities that provides them with a competitive advantage in a tight labor market. On the other hand, the social exchange theory is based on the give and back philosophy, where giving employees with unique value propositions could ensure their long-term association with an organization. The signaling theory has also emerged from the marketing literature, which is based on communicating clear, consistent, and honest branding signals in the labor market that could enhance employees' decision to remain for a longer period of time in an organization. The person-organization fit theory has three factors of fit, links, and sacrifices. In terms of the branding concept, a better match between employees' goals, culture, and values with that of organizations, resources, goals, and culture could lead to favorable employee outcomes in an organization. However, the present study has undertaken social identity as well as psychological contract theory to advance comprehension in the employer branding literature. Introduced in the 1970s, social identity theory has divided identities as personal and social identities. Personal identity being sense of self, social identities are the ones that are shared among the group members. As individuals strive for self-esteem and self-continuity, so they are likely to engage with those groups that are consistent with their sense of self. As it was only confined to understand identities in terms of group behavior, so Ashworth and Mail in the year of 1989 extended it to understand in terms of organizational behavior, and that's how organizational identification emerged. In terms of the branding concept, organizational identification could internalize organizational values among employees. It could generate a perception of oneness or belongingness to an organization. It could infuse a sense of pride and esteem associated by working for a branded organization, and could also persuade employees to seek and maintain their memberships with the employer. On the other hand, psychological contract is an implicit contract based on two factors of mutual trust and understanding, has been classified as transactional and relational contracts. Transactional contracts are based on monetary exchanges that are quite specific, narrow, and short-term oriented, whereas relational contracts are based on non-monetary exchanges that are quite comprehensive, based on long-term reciprocal obligations, aiming to develop and maintain relationships in an organization. So according to the branding concept, when employees enter into an organization, they are promised a positive and unique employment experience. And if it is provided throughout the employment cycle, then that leads to fulfillment of psychological contract, which could enhance their decisions to remain for a longer period of time in an organization. So according to this theory, there is a need to infuse realistic job previews with realistic promises in the recruitment human resource practices. The study is important because, first of all, it would unveil the dimensions of employer branding relevant to the Indian IT sector. It would aid the organizations to plan large-scale retention of employees. It would further address the criticality of a positive identity and fulfillment of psychological contract for improved retention levels. The study has been conducted on tech industry in India that contributes to around 7.7% to the country's GDP, has 55% of the market share, pays more than the BFSI sector, that is banking, financial services, and insurance sector. Also, it is witnessing high turnover rates looming between 25 to 40%, according to a NASSCOM report of 2019. The study would address the following objectives. The journal objective is to assess the concept of employer branding in the Indian IT sector by crystallizing a model consisting of dimensions, mediators, and outcome. The specific objectives would focus on capturing the domain of employer branding and its related dimensions, empirically testing the proposed model for assessing the relationship between employer branding and employee retention, exploring the mediating role of social identity and psychological contract in the relationship between employer branding and employee retention, further suggesting appropriate strategies for improved retention levels among employees working in the IT sector. The scope of the study is limited to 5 employer branding characteristics of perceived organizational support, corporate social responsibility, training and development, work-life balance, and compensation and benefits. Retention is restricted to the behavioral outcome of intentions to stay. The mediation of organizational identification and psychological contract has been considered to explain the facilitators and outcomes of employer branding. The study has been carried out in the Indian context, as business practices in India, they kind of differ from that of Western organizations, and the focus of the study is on the IT sector. In order to conduct the literature review, the researcher has divided the literature review into 2 parts, journal and specific literature review. The journal literature review has focused on the studies that have assessed the basic concept of employer branding, dimensionality of employer branding, consequences of employer branding, and employee retention. The specific literature review has focused on the studies that have assessed the two concepts of employer branding and employee retention and have further classified them based on IT context, non-IT context, Indian context, and non-Indian context. The researcher has also identified those studies that have considered the direct and indirect effect of organizational identification and psychological contract in the relationship between employer branding and employee retention. Based on the literature review, the following model has been proposed, consisting of 5 employer branding dimensions, 2 mediators, and 1 outcome variable. Based on the model, the following hypotheses have been proposed. The first set of hypotheses deals with the relationship between employee value propositions and employee retention, with 5 propositions of perceived organizational support, corporate social responsibility, training and development, work-life balance, and compensation and benefits. The second set of hypotheses deals with the relationship between employer branding and organizational identification and employee retention, and the mediation of organizational identification in the relationship between employer branding and employee retention. The third set of hypotheses deals with the relationship between employer branding and psychological contract and employee retention, and the mediation of psychological contract in the relationship between employer branding and employee retention. In order to measure all these items, various scales have been adopted. In order to measure employee branding, 23 items for 5 constructs have been adopted, 6 for perceived organizational support, 4 for corporate social responsibility, 6 for training and development, 3 for work-life balance, and 4 for compensation and benefits. 6 items each have been adopted for 2 mediators, and in order to measure employee retention, intentions to stay scale has been adopted. All the items have been measured on 7-point type Likert scale, and all the demographic variables have been considered as covariates or control variables for the present study. The study is descriptive in nature, that is based on the survey of top IT brands that have topped the ranking list of Randstad, Universum, and Great Place to Work. The design of the study is cross-section in nature because the data has been collected at a single point of time and from the same respondents.